Welcome to Equine Assisted World. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times best-selling author of The Horse Boy, founder of New Trails Learning Systems and LongRideHome.com. You can find details of all our programs and shows on rupertisaacson.com. Here on Equine Assisted World, we look at the cutting edge and the best practices currently being developed and established in the equine assisted field. This can be psychological, this can be psych, this can be physical, this can be all of the conditions that human beings have that these lovely equines, these beautiful horses that we work with, help us with. Thank you for being part of the adventure, and we hope you enjoy today's show. Welcome back to Equine Assisted World. Today we've got Jane Faulkner. Jane Faulkner is, like everyone who comes on Equine Assisted World, jolly interesting. She runs Equine Assisted Therapy Australia. For those of you who are familiar with equine assisted psychotherapy, it's a fascinating tool for helping people get to the bottom of their stuff and make the necessary changes that they need to get to happier places in life. And of course, because it's being done with horses, this is not, sitting opposite somebody in a office on a couch feeling terrible about yourself and sort of compounding the trauma. The equine assisted psychotherapy work has been well studied for getting really lasting outcomes. And there seems to be a magic with mixing this with not just the horse, but the movement and the environment that the horses create. But what's interesting about Jane is that she did not come into horses as many of us did as sort of initiated cult members as children. She came in a little bit through the side door in a slightly indirect way. And those of you who listened to our interview with Lynn Thomas, who founded Igala, might see a parallel there in that when people seem to come into the equine assisted world from outside of the equine world, often they can bring with them insights that perhaps we horse obsessed people might not see, because we sometimes can't see the wood for the trees because we like ponies so much. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Jane, and I'm going to ask you how you got there, because your story is fascinating. And I think all of the adventures that you've had give you the perspective to be able to offer what you offer to both clients and the people who do your 2-year diploma in equine assisted psychotherapy in Australia. And this thing of life experience in general is so important, rather than just, I got a degree in therapy and I like horses, so off we're going. Yeah, it's very important that one has this great variety of experience. So Jane, over to you. Can you tell us where you began in life and your early experience?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a little town called Waterford in Queensland in Australia with 3 brothers and on a river, the Logan River. So it was kind of semi-rural. We were just on an acre, but we were surrounded by acreage. So I was outside all the time as a kid, swimming across the river, playing soccer. And my neighbours actually had horses. And so I loved them from next door. So I remember going over and they used to put molasses in the feed. I remember being excited about having some of the molasses, but not really having much interaction apart from a pat other than that. And I think I never really entertained having horses because I just knew that we couldn't. So I grew up to an English dad and an Australian mum. And my childhood was, I was quite a responsible kid. And so I looked after my brothers and just felt really at home outside. Was pretty bossy.
And that equips you well for the horse world, yeah.
It's true. It was pretty bossy and at that age, had quite a strong sense of self. Then as a teenager, so I guess my dad was quite a very stressed out man. And I think as kids, we were quite scared of him. So when I hit the teenage, so I learned to suppress a lot and kind of be a really good kid. So I didn't really ever get in trouble, did the right thing, looked after my brothers. But as I got into my teenage years, I started developing acne. And I think a big part of that was my emotions erupting through my skin. So that kind of led me to really get curious about health and well-being. And it made me, I think differently to a lot of my peers. So I felt really ugly and a lot of shame around having the acne. So I think I was focused on a career and learning and understanding why my body was doing what it was doing. So for me, I was lucky. I had some amazing neighbors and they were into meditation and they were into naturopathy. And they kind of opened a door for me at 16 to kind of start looking into myself and getting curious about how my thoughts were creating my reality, I guess. And I used to go to meditations with them. At the time, it was spiritual meditations, where you're kind of opening up to the spiritual world and getting curious about all of that kind of stuff. And I loved that. That was really kind of my jam. From there, as a teenager, I never really felt like I fit in because I look back and I realized I was a pretty deep kid. And I guess feeling so ugly, I was never really into the mating game or the party scene. I was more into learning about taking care of myself and my health and understanding who I was. So I was pretty not sure what I wanted to do when I left school. Mum was a nurse. She was like, "Why don't you do nursing?" I studied nursing, and that was a real challenge for me because I could see how the system wasn't really a health system. It was it went against a lot of what I was learning about what health is. And again, I guess I felt like I didn't really fit in. And as a nurse as well, I just worked. I think as a nurse, you're taught to not really, you're a better nurse when you don't have needs. So not having breaks and just always kind of giving to your patients. So for me, I burnt out. And because I loved the people contact, I loved talking with people, but I just didn't like how people in the system were kind of a number. The system wasn't interested in that person or their history or why they might have developed the illness that they had developed. So after I studied nursing, and when I worked as a nurse here in Australia, I worked in a clinic in New Farm in Brisbane, and we worked with the local prostitutes and the local transgender populations that were wanting to kind of transition. So I loved that job and I loved the different people I worked with. And I guess it was around...
What did you love? What did you love about that particular work in those particular populations?
Yeah, thanks for asking me that. I think it was their realness, their authenticity. They were surviving. I remember having a client who was 13 living in a car, having to prostitute herself. And she was just so real. There was no masks. There was no bullshit. There was, I need these drugs. She just kind of knew what she wanted, knew what she needed. Yeah. And I think I really liked that. There was no having to work hard to work out what she wanted or who she was. It was just there in plain sight. And I really loved that about, working at that clinic and I guess working with people as a nurse, because you are seeing people at their most vulnerable, people sick, dying, mentally ill. And it gets rid of a lot of the pretense and the superficialities of life. And I really liked that. But as I said, so I liked the people part, but I didn't like the system part. So for me, I traveled, I went overseas, nursed over there. And
overseas and over there is quite a large sort of blanket.
London. Yeah, so I worked in London. I worked in the London clinic. I worked in one of the big hospitals in northern London. And then I worked as a private nurse. Say again?
Whittington, by any chance?
No, it wasn't. It started with an R. I can't think what it was called. It's a
Not to worry,
huge
just the Whittington was
hospital.
the one closest to me in North London growing up. I wondered if I might have been walked past you accidentally on the street, perhaps, if
Yeah,
a bit early
quite possibly.
on.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, going overseas was amazing because it gave me a chance to really work out who I was.
Mhm.
And being overseas, I went with my brother, my older brother, but we met a whole new group of people over there. And I remember having this realization that I can be who I want over here. Nobody knows who I am. And realizing how being at home, I kind of let myself be boxed into this persona that people thought of as Jane. So for me, being overseas was really liberating. I looked into a lot of different natural therapies. And again, I was trying to get to the root cause of my health. So I went and saw different flower essence practitioners. I worked with an amazing shaman over there in London.
Who was, and what type
Her
of...
name was V. Masciarelli, and she was a French woman, and she'd worked with a lot of shamans through Africa and South America. So we did a lot of vision kind of questing the drum. And for me, that work, I just felt like I'd come home in that work. It felt I just felt really comfortable in it.
When you vision quested, for someone who's never done that,
Yes.
and, you've got to remember a lot of the listeners are coming out of, perhaps not quite such explorative,
There it is.
experiences. Describe what you saw when you were vision questing with the drum, how it helped you. Can you be kind of a bit just specific briefly about that?
Yeah,
Interesting.
sure. Yeah. So for me, I remember one particular, it was like previous lives that I'd had that I went back to. So I remember one of them, and I was like a crazy woman. I remember I had big hair and I was in a cage and I was kind of being taunted. And vision questing is kind of weird because you're seeing things and you're feeling things and you're having ideas about what these things are. And for me, it was like a realization that I think I'd been a medicine woman and I'd been kind of persecuted for that. And that was super helpful for me to understand because a lot of myself before that time I'd kind of kept under wraps and not expressed to others and just never dared share with people. Or so a lot of my even investigating into the different healing arts that I investigated when I lived overseas, I didn't share with my nursing friends that I lived with in a flat in London. I remember because I was seeing a Chinese herbalist and I would cook the herbs up in the flat in London and all my friends thought I was crazy and the herbs stunk. So they were like, oh my God.
And not just the herbs or the insect casings and other stuff they give you.
Yeah. So that was one of the vision, but other vision quests that just made feelings I have in this life make sense or made decisions I make or ways that I was in the world. It made those ways make sense. And so in that way, it really helped me. And also realizing that, I experienced that, which led me to do this. I'm not experiencing that anymore, so I don't need to do this anymore. So I found it hugely helpful.
Was it largely about letting go of things that were unhelpful, basically?
Yeah. And getting insights into why I was doing those things.
Can I ask you, just before you go to the next phase of your life, you said your dad was very stressed out. Why? What was stressing him?
My dad was English and he grew up.
Oh, well, that's
he remembers
right there. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean that. I'm trying to. So I think many things. So when I think of his life now, like he remembers being 8 and hiding under a table as the bombs were dropping.
Oh, okay.
And then his father died when he was 16. And then as he kind of grew up, he went through a divorce and then moved out to Australia and kind of had, I guess, 4 of us kids. And I think it was his stress of providing for us. And I also think he was a person that struggled to let things go, struggled. So he held a lot of emotion in. He didn't really share his challenges or anything like that. He just kind of would come home a ball of stress. And I think he also had high expectations of us kids and how he wanted things to be.
Right.
I was just going to say, he's a beautiful man. I think it was, just him not knowing how to process things, and then home being the place where he could let out stress. Or
What did he do for a living, out of interest?
he was a civil engineer.
Okay,
Yeah.
so lots of responsibility, also standing on his shoulders for the projects, working for the bridges not falling down after they're built, etc. Yeah, which is not inconsiderable. And as you say, sort of growing up with the war, the Blitz happening around him, and then post-war austerity. And I think there was, just as someone who grew up, I'm not obviously as old as he was, but born in the 60s, central London, what's now the financial district of London, did not look then like it looks now. A lot of it was still bombed flat when I was a kid. And we played on the bomb sites, and we found all sorts of things because of that, archaeological stuff that had been thrown up, from the Iron Age onwards, but also lots of fragments of bombs and that sort of thing, and lots of houses still laid waste and shattered. So I can also see how kids that grew up sort of through the Depression, and then through the war, and then the post-war austerity, perhaps coming out to Australia and saying, well, you kids have it made. You're here in the golden land, and the high expectations you talk about, you aren't hampered by the things I was hampered with. So therefore my expectations of you are perhaps higher than is comfortable. I could see it. And I just wanted to ask you this because as you know, when any of us are working in the equine assisted, well, we kind of want to know the picture. We want to know the story. I always feel the story is where the healing is. And if we don't know the background story with our clients or the horses we're working with, let alone ourselves, it's very difficult to, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
So thank you for just sharing that, because I think that helps inform me.
Not at all.
Of where you go. So, okay, you're in London, and you're cooking up beetle casings and iron and fung of toad, and you're also going to see a shaman, but you're also working, as a nurse in clinic.
Yes.
What happens to you next?
So from there, I go to India, and in London. So I used to be a runner, and I used to run around Kensington Park every day, and then I got shin splints. Because I couldn't run anymore. And I was like, oh man, I'm a person that really likes to move every day. And there was a yoga sign, and I was like, oh, heard about this yoga, I might give it a go. So I went to a yoga class, and it was awesome, and I just loved it. And so I started going to yoga every day, and yoga wasn't cool back then, and the internet hadn't really started. So back in the old days. And so I asked the teacher, where can I learn this? And they told me about a place in India. So I went to India, studied yoga over there, which was a huge eye-opener for me. I really wasn't expecting India to be like it was. I'd been through
that's
Europe.
Another big blanket statement. As someone who's lived in India myself, I want you to go into some details. Also, what kind of yoga?
So back then, to start with, it was Hatha yoga back then at the Shivananda ashram, and I loved the ashram. But for me, I remember arriving in India, and I hadn't planned anything because my brother and I had backpacked, and we'd just arrived somewhere and pulled out the Lonely Planet book and gone and got a hostel. And anyway, I remember getting to India and getting out of the plane and thinking I'll just sit in the lounge and go through my Lonely Planet and work out where I'm going to stay. I remember arriving in India, and there was no lounge. It was just literally.
And that smell as you get off the plane, the
Yes. And just,
overwhelming of like urine of 8 million people, you can almost smell
yes.
the plane comes down. Yeah.
And then all these people, all these Indian rickshaw drivers just around me. And I totally,
Yeah.
I was terrified. So I went up to all these other Western women and I was like, where are you going? Can I come with you?
Right. Very practical, very
And
wise. Yeah.
luckily one of the women said, yep, you can come with me. She was a medical student and she was over there to work in a hospital. So I went with her and I remember just the shock. So it was about 3 a.m. in the morning over there. The shock of
When the plane got in.
being on that. Yeah.
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 Dangerous time.
Like, yeah. So, and I remember, just driving through the streets and seeing bodies on the ground and, beggars on, those wooden slats with the wheels underneath and just the shock of that in my system. And so, and then we were in the local YHA and I didn't leave the hotel the next day. I was so frightened. I remember just eating like the plainest biscuits and being very scared. And then
Was that
until I got,
in Bombay, now Mumbai, or was that what?
no, it was Chennai,
Okay. What used to be
Madras.
Madras.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not
Hot,
even a
humid,
huge
crowded,
Indian city.
crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think I've got the train down to Kerala, which was where the ashram was. And I remember arriving at the ashram. I can't remember much about the train trip. I was probably terrified the whole time. But I remember arriving at the ashram and they were chanting. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is a cult. And just being really worried about what I'd shown up to. And then I think the next day the training started and I just loved it. It was people from all over the world. It was a huge group of people in this training. And just learning all about yogic philosophy and just living in that ashram life. I love
For those people who have never lived in an ashram and don't know what that entails, can you walk us through a day in an ashram and with the yoga practice one? What is it doing for you? What's happening in your body? What's happening in your brain? Why is this good for you?
Yeah. So we would start the day early, so with sunrise, and we would go into the big hall and meditate. So we'd sit in silence for an hour, and then we would chant. So
And what would you chant?
We would chant all these different mantras and kind of, they're not called songs. What are they called? My brain not helping me.
Yeah.
But different kind of, mantras mostly.
In
the mantras
the old Sanskrit language.
in the old Sanskrit language. Yeah. So we would have a chanting book and we would chant straight from that book. And the different mantras have different benefits. So I know anytime when we got into the bus to travel, we would chant a mantra before we kind of traveled. But so we'd start with that meditation. Then we would do the chanting for an hour and a half. And then we would do our yoga practice. And that, I think, went for another hour and a half. And then we would have breakfast. Then we would have karma yoga, which is like jobs. Mine was to clean the toilet with a bit of coconut rusk.
Neat.
That was interesting. Yeah, that was pretty hard. And then we had yogic philosophy. So we would learn about yogic philosophy. Then I think we had a few hours off in the afternoon. Then we'd have another hour and a half chant and then more meditation and then more of a kind of yogic discourse of an evening and then go to bed.
So when people are, the reason I'm wanting to pause here in India at this ashram for a moment is I think it can be difficult for Westerners to understand that, for example, if one replaces the word mantra with the word psalm, or one replaces the word chant with the word pray, And as a kid who grew up somewhat against my will as a chorister in the Temple Church in London, the call and response of the Psalms and, God be with you and with thy spirit, and all of that stuff, we can sort of assimilate whether we like it or not as Westerners, because we're familiar with it, it's around us. And then we go out we see people in India, with a shaved head and a dot between their eyes, and a body that is different to ours because they're sitting there in a dhoti, a cloth instead of a pair of pants, and a string that we wonder what that string means that's around their torso, and blah, blah. So it all looks very, very different. But in fact, they're praying and they're singing and they're and of course, even within the Western traditions, meditation has been a thing forever to quiet the mind. Okay, we could see the benefits of that. One of the things which I think is not talked about much is the benefits of chanting and singing and mantras, why they work, whether it's people talking about, say, law of attraction and affirmations, putting an affirmation on your mirror, I am worthy, or you are beautiful, or I am a money magnet, or whatever it is. But this other thing about chanting peace into the world, and I know, like the Rastafarians talk about chanting down Babylon, chanting evil from the world and sort of putting good into the world. And then the vibrations of within the body of these ways of breathing that create the mantras and the chants seem to have incredibly beneficial effects on both our brain waves. They put EEGs on people's heads and the immune system and so on. But this is often not talked about. And that's why I just wanted to pause here and say, it's not just navel gazing, right?
No, not at all. And I think of the wisdom of these ancient cultures. And so I know in the Sanskrit language, the different sounds they believe have a different impact on different parts of our body. So different sounds correlate to supporting different chakras. And I guess for me back then, so I was 22, I just know how I used to feel at the end of chanting. Like my mind would clear, my heart would feel open. I would just feel connected and free. So, and when I think about it, I thought the yoga asana would have the biggest impact, or the meditation, but it was definitely the chanting that had the biggest impact. And especially, I think there was a group of 200 of us. And so all of us chanting, and it was powerful. It was really, really powerful.
Yeah, was it Nikola Tesla who said, if you want to understand the mysteries of the universe, think in terms of frequency and vibration? And of course, what is that but frequency and vibration, I guess?
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like I'm loving actually that science feels like it's catching up to a lot of these beliefs and practices that Indigenous cultures have had forever, that kind of help us be whole humans. And it kind of humors me a little bit that Western culture needs to wait for the science to believe it's real or okay, or
Well, the Catholic Church was a powerful thing, Jane.
oh man, wasn't it? It really was.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm realizing more and more each day just how powerful the systems that have governed our lives are.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't know if you're aware that in the 11th century in Europe, there was a huge surge of mysticism within Christianity, and figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who was the first, female gynecologist, she's still the most published female composer, I think, of all time. All her stuff is still there in print. She books on herbalism, but she also had crusades sent against her and her nunnery, and managed to fight them off because the local people were so reliant on the medicine that she and her sisters were producing. And then she managed to make friends with the Holy Roman Emperor and sort of find safety this way. But in this sort of went on, and then by the 16th century, the church was actually banning a lot of the chants that were on a 6-note scale that people like Hildegard and Bingen were using, because people were saying, well, with this, we feel so connected to God, we sort of don't need the church. And that was not good news for the church. So yes, as you say, the desire for control before you even get to things like witch burning, and, you're talking about a past life, vision experience in your shamanic thing, or perhaps being a medicine woman who is persecuted. And that must be in the ancestral lines of so many women in our culture and men.
Yeah.
We live where I'm interviewing you here. If I look to the north through the window, I look towards a town called Idstein. I'm in Germany, which has a witch's tower where they were all kept. There's a memorial with the names, because they kept the names of all the people that were burned, and half of them were men. But yes, anyone with any sort of connection to God. So you're saying, you find it funny that science is having to catch up in Western culture. But of course, we killed science, didn't we? We killed science along with spirituality.
Yeah, the true science.
Yeah.
Where you can think. And it's interesting, as I hear you talking, I'm thinking of the First Nations people here in Australia and their ways and their connection to country and their deep spiritual connection and insight, and how when the white man came over here, how threatened the white people were of those that First Nation spirituality. And I was working with amazing First Nations elder. I did some training with her just on how First Nations people view spirituality and how they work spiritually. And she was saying how when the white man came and started to kind of see the First Nations magic and spirituality, how the First Nations people actually made decisions to shut down different aspects of their spirituality to kind of keep themselves safe, because it was such a threat to the white people that had come.
Absolutely. And I think that's a tale that could be told from any
Everywhere.
culture that was impacted by the colonial experience. And the colonial experience, of course, wasn't just white. It's happened from Asian country to Asian country. It's happened within Africa, from African to African. It's happened. But obviously the big one was what exploded out of Europe. And
I was just going to, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
What I am loving is in Australia, I feel like there's an awareness of that our systems are broken. So our health, school, and I'm loving that we're getting more and more curious about our First Nations people's systems. And so it's kind of, in Australia, we're starting to see this blossoming and this curiosity and an openness now, which and a respect for First Nations culture and ways, which I'm really loving.
So, I want to return to this a little bit later, because I have a very profound experience with my autistic son with the Kuku Yalanji up in the Daintree rainforest. A very profound healing. But so, yes, I'm absolutely with you.
So before you move on, we have a cultural advisor, and they're her people.
Okay. Then she probably knows the healer that healed my son.
She probably does. She's amazing.
Yeah. Well,
what a small world.
Yes, it is. Okay. So you're in India. You're finding that the chanting, the quieting the mind, the cleansing of the body through the chanting, that obviously the yogic practice is good for your body as well as your mind. But you're in somewhat of a ivory tower in an ashram. One is protected from the seething, maelstrom of humanity that you saw at 3 a.m. when you're coming off that plane and had to humble yourself to actually ask for help from a stranger. So I basically say, I don't know what I'm doing. Please help me out, which must have been very humbling to a tough Aussie, to actually say, look, sorry, I've lost. Can you help me out? I made a little note there saying, that was a moment of humility, which must have resonated. But then, okay, so you're in this ivory tower, you're having this wonderful experience. How do you parlay that then into your next experience?
Hmm. So from that ashram, I went to another ashram called Alma's. Have you heard of the
Oh yes,
hugging
up in Kerala,
saint?
the lady who
Yes,
hugged. Yes.
yes. So I went to her ashram, and that was very different. It wasn't a protected ivory tower, and that was quite a shock. And what shocked me around that was how indoctrinated the people were. And that sounded terrible, didn't it?
Well,
Just
can you
what I
be more
meant
specific?
was, yeah, so how if Amma was somewhere where a crowd just chased to get to where she was,
Yeah.
and for me, it didn't feel good to see people doing that, to see people not in their own sovereignty, to kind of and to kind of be worshipping this other human. I couldn't get my head around
Did
it.
you get to
So
meet her at all, Amma?
I did. I got to meet her and give her a hug. And she asked me to, how she asked people to sit behind her. So
Mhm.
I sat behind her, and yeah, and I could feel that. I could feel that, her beautiful spirit. I could feel that. I don't know. I just, what I wanted, I feel like I didn't feel blinded by it though. And that's
Yeah.
what I couldn't understand with a lot of the other people that were blinded to the humanity around them, and they would do whatever they could to be near Amma. And for me, I was just like, this isn't congruent. You're chanting and wanting to be like Amma, and yet you'll push people out of the road, and you won't care how you get near her.
Yeah.
So I couldn't understand how all of that was together in this place, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So
So how did you end up? Everyone in India goes through this. What was the way you ended up coming to terms with paradox and ambiguity, which India
mm,
shoves firmly into one's face?
it really does. Gosh, how did I? I think I learned to just watch,
Okay.
sit back, watch, get curious.
Get
Um,
curious that's a good, yeah.
yeah, yeah, get really curious and kind of not overthink it. So get curious, notice, and then make the next decision that felt right for myself. So I didn't stay in Amma's ashram long. I struggled too much with that. Yeah, that how paradoxical it was. I was just like, oh, this isn't. It just didn't feel right for me. Yeah. So after there, I went back to London and nursed a little more, and then my brother and I went to South America, and we spent 3 months in South America, just kind of starting up in Ecuador and then moving down through Peru, across Bolivia and through Rio. And that was another eye-opening experience. I realized I was a very naive person. Like, again, I remember being on the plane, reading The Lonely Planet, and it's seeing all these warnings for kidnappings and all of that kind of stuff. But we arrived in Quito in Ecuador, and so we learnt Spanish over there because people weren't able to speak English. And we went to the very top of Ecuador, to the Ecuadorian Colombian border. And we went deep into the Amazon with a guide and stayed in the Amazon, I think it was for a week. And that was an amazing experience, just kind of staying like really deep in. Because I remember it took us 2 days to get where we went. And I remember the water of the Amazon River getting clearer and cleaner. And yeah, and just kind of, there was my brother and I and another couple, and we stayed with a family in deep in the jungle there. And South America, again, for me was quite shocking. And I think it was in a different way to India. India didn't, I think the spirituality of India, it wasn't so much evident in South America. And
No.
life felt cheap in South America. People had guns. And I felt a bit like a walking ATM machine, like people would kind of beg. And it just felt like, the different drug mafia and stuff like that. We kind of went, a little bit off the beaten track. And so had a few frightening encounters with different people dressed up as the army with machine guns across their chest and things like that. And I look back now and think, wow, that was like I tell my kids stories and it's like, man, did I really do that? Because it was quite an amazing adventure. I'm really grateful for the experience. I remember at the time I was reading a book called How to Live This Year as If It's Your Last. And it was actually really helpful because every day felt like I could have died today. Like I remember being on a bus again in the middle of the night and there was a massive landslide. And we were on a bus full of smugglers that they were miners, but they had smuggled a lot of birds into their pockets and into bags and stuff like that. And we'd come to a checkpoint and my brother and I had to get out and they just had to check our papers. And seeing the police or whoever it was getting on with the dog and walking up and down through the bus, and you could hear the birds and then just getting off and us keeping on going. And apparently one of our guides had dogged them in. And so we had the rest of this bus trip with all these people that had smuggled these birds. And we got to this point where there was a massive mudslide. We had to all get off the bus and walk across and around where the rest of the road was. And I just remember the whole time my senses being heightened, me really being aware of, life and how precious it was and not having much else in my mind but who's around me, what am I doing, where am I going? It's those basic kind of survival.
Yes, absolutely. I can relate to that, having had a few of those myself. Okay, so you're in South America. You survive it. Life is cheap, but life is wonderful. It's scary. You realize that you were perhaps taking some risks that you're a bit lucky you didn't pay for. And then I presume you come back to London or back to Australia at this point?
No, I came back to London and then realized I needed to go home. I needed to feel anchored to something. So came back home, went back to nursing. It just didn't fit me anymore. So looked into other things, studied Hawaiian massage for a while and then did a 2-year-long yoga apprenticeship. And that was, again, every day, 2 hours of yoga, meditation, assisting teachers. So it was a real life of yoga for 2 years. And that was life-changing for me. So in a really good way, just helped me really become aware of my thoughts. And it's a process, I guess, of just looking at yourself all the time.
And you're still making your living at this point as a nurse? That's how you're paying the bills?
No, then I was massaging while I was doing my yoga apprenticeship.
Okay. So you've actually now switched to a full massage profession.
Yeah.
And that's not inconsiderable. And doing that in London?
No, I'd come back to Australia.
Okay, right,
so
fine.
Nursing was London.
Because also London is so expensive to live in. It's not an easy place to pay the rent, if you're going to just do massage and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Totally. It was funny in London. There was about 10 of us Aussies in a flat.
Yeah.
In Bayswater.
I remember those days.
It's great.
Yeah, it's brilliant fun. Okay, so you're back. You're a massage therapist. We still have not got a horse in sight.
No, no horse in sight. So massage therapist, doing my yoga apprenticeship. In my yoga apprenticeship, I started some of my familiar relationship issues kept coming up. And I think my skin, I still had acne. And I was like, man, I just want to get to the bottom of this. And I went to a naturopath and he said, do you ever get angry? And I said, no. And he said, oh, maybe you should go and see this therapist. And it was a Gestalt therapist. So I went and saw this Gestalt therapist. I feel sorry for that therapist forever because I remember them asking me, what do you need? And I was like, I don't know. I had no real idea about myself.
Now, not everybody
But
knows what Gestalt therapy is. Can you tell us, please?
yeah, sure. So it's a type of therapy that was, I guess, put together by a man called Fritz Perls. And Gestalt is very much about supporting someone to be in the here and now with their experience. So someone might be telling you a story of their childhood. As a Gestalt therapist, I might say, what are you noticing now as you tell me about being 8? So it's very much about what's happening in the here and now. And it's a lot about getting curious about how someone, we call it makes contact or shows up, and how they break contact or disappear. And so as a Gestalt therapist, I'm always supporting or trying to help someone make contact with themselves and with me and with their environment. And I'm trying to support them to become aware of how they break that contact or how they move away from that experience.
Okay. So
Mm.
you say when you see clients now, so you went as a client, but now you become
Yes. Yes.
a
Yeah, yeah,
therapist.
yeah. 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 So from that, I studied Gestalt therapy.
I just want to do
Um,
a quick terms thing. Gestalt's a German word, right? So, but in English, it tends to mean, I'm looking here on my Oxford Dictionary,
okay.
an
Yeah.
organized whole that is
Yes.
perceived as more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
So are you saying then that Gestalt therapy is a quest for the full self? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a way nicer way to put it than I put it. Yes. That's exactly it. It's like, who are you? And how can we help you let go of what stops you being your full self? How can we uncover your full self, and how can we support you to become aware of how you stop yourself from being your full self?
So by now we're sort of moving into the realm of psychotherapy, no?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So
Ponies?
not yet. Not yet. So 4-year Gestalt training. In that time, I had my 2 children, which was huge for me because I was sitting in a group of people talking about how their parents had screwed them up, and I was entering into parenting.
Always very
So yeah,
insightful.
yeah. So I did my Gestalt training. I had just finished that, was starting to study art therapy,
Okay.
and I was doing my art therapy training. That was a 2-year training.
Why
And
art
a
therapy?
friend,
Because you haven't talked about a love of art or being an artist up until now.
yeah, no, I think someone I knew was doing it, and I was curious and I liked learning. And
Mhm.
I was like, sure. I think I didn't want to stop learning. I think there's no greater, there's no good reason behind it. It was very powerful though, that art therapy training. Very powerful work working with your hands. So kind of bypasses that
Right, and
all the
creating images
filters
that
that,
come out of your subconscious, right? So that what you
yeah,
draw, what you create
yeah,
might reflect something that you're not actually expressing verbally, right?
yeah, yeah. Or even aware of
Yeah.
within yourself. Yeah, so it was when I had towards the end of art therapy, a friend and I went to a retreat center, and she said, "Oh, there's this new therapy, equine assisted therapy. Why don't we have a go?"
Okay.
And I was like,
Okay.
"Yeah." And I was like, "Oh, radio." And I had a session, and it just got straight to my core stuff. And I was like, wow, I want to learn this. And then there was a teacher coming out from the States to teach it. So I went to his training, and it just had a profound impact on me.
Okay. So
And
just let's back up here. What
yeah,
kind of equine assisted therapy was this? Who was the dude? Tell us a bit more
yeah,
background.
sure. So his name was Dewey Freeman,
Louis
and
Freeman. Okay.
Dewey Freeman, yeah, and he runs the Gestalt Equine Institute of the Rockies.
Okay. The Gestalt.
And
Is that something we should be
equine,
checking out?
yeah, Dewey's amazing.
Okay.
Uh, Dewey and Joni Rieger, I think her name was.
Dewey Freeman and Joni Riga.
Riga, yeah. I think I'm mispronouncing
And
her.
where are they? Are they in the Rockies? Are they Boulder, Colorado? Where are they?
I think so.
Hmm.
Think
I'll
so.
look it up quickly
Yeah.
as you tell us. All
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
So
yeah, sure.
you show up, and now suddenly, for the first time since you're a little girl, looking at your neighbor's horses, you got a
Yeah.
pony in the room.
Yes. Yeah. And it was
What happened to you?
intense. So I went, and so it was at a woman called Meg Kirby's place, and I'm always grateful to Meg Kirby for bringing Dewey out to Australia. And she had a large herd, and there were some mares, and they had some yearlings. I think they were yearlings. And one of the first exercises, Dewey said, kind of go out into the paddock and let's just see what happens. And these yearlings just kept coming up to me and like nudging me in the chest, and I got started getting really overwhelmed. And I must have looked way out of my depth because he came and stood in front of me. And he said, because the mare then started coming towards me, not looking very happy at what was happening. And so he stood in front of me and he said, is this familiar that people push past your boundaries? And I think I was a bit out of body, but I was
But
like
that's
nodding
interesting.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. And he invited me to go and stand and put my hands on this beautiful old grey mare called Stormy. And he said, I want you to just feel into Stormy and her energy and her connection. Yes, that was a really powerful first experience second, because the first one had been at the retreat center, but yeah, it was had a massive impact on me.
Okay, so how did that then develop into? I'm just, by the way, looking. Dewey, it's
Yes.
Duey, not Dewey, Dewewy. So Dewey Freeman. And I just looked up Gestalt Equine Institute of the Rockies. It's actually just south of Denver, between Denver and Colorado Springs. So for those listeners who are in that area, you might want to check it out. Okay,
Yeah.
so he helps you with Stormy. You feel suddenly grounded. You feel he's pointed out to you that perhaps you're someone who doesn't make your boundaries as effective as you might, because his yearlings are stomping all over you. And how does that get you from? How do you go from that insight as a sort of patient, if you like, to where you are, to where you begin to actually say, I'm going to offer this?
Yeah. So from there, I asked the other people at the course, how do I get a horse? How do I know which horse to get? And where should I start?
That sounds like a rabbit hole.
There was a man from Tasmania, and he said, your horse will come to you. And I was like, radio, I'll just, kind of see what happens. And I knew I had to learn horsemanship first because I didn't know anything. So I came back up Queensland and I found a woman that taught horsemanship, and I started learning horsemanship from her. And the horses terrified me. Like, I remember her horse, Penny. I was terrified. I remember the first time being beside Penny, and her name was Eula, and Penny kind of pinning her ear and cocking her leg. And Eula she's kind of saying, don't bring that here. Because I was terrified to touch her. I was terrified to be in her space. And Eula, over time, just kind of helped me feel more comfortable around Penny. And Eula got a second horse called Phoenix. And it was really funny. I knew as soon as I saw Phoenix, I knew he was going to be my horse. And I didn't like him. I feel terrible saying that now. I think he already pushed my buttons. And so we worked with Phoenix. And then Eula had to go away up to Darwin. And she said, do you want to have Phoenix? And I didn't even want to make a decision. I said to my husband, been offered this horse. Can you go meet him? And my husband went and saw him and just loved him.
Interesting.
And so we brought Phoenix home. And Phoenix, he really scared the crap out of me.
Now, hold on. You say you bring him home, but we all know that those of us who keep horses, that involves the infrastructure of a horse type property. You have not yet said that you were living in any place where you could keep horses, or that even knew how to keep horses or anyone had mentored you in how to keep horses. So just
Yeah.
go into those details a little bit. How did you jump over those hurdles?
So I was lucky in that the woman across, so I do live in a rural area now. I'm on 13 acres. We fenced our place off, and I was super lucky that the woman across the road from us, Laurel, was a horsewoman. And she was very kind and very supportive in teaching me kind of how to be around horses, what to, because I didn't know what to feed or
Okay.
anything. I
So
remember
you had a
Beulah.
mentor, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so a mentor with feeding and caring for, but not for, because Phoenix really intimidated me. Like he was really sure of himself, and I just, he could just boss me around with his ears. And he did. And so I went to a really cool horse trainer called Angie Wicks, and she really helped me kind of learn to work and be around Phoenix and how to earn his respect. And that really helped. That kind of, because I think before that, especially coming through the equine assisted therapy world, I was a bit of that horses as magical unicorns was a bit like, wow, they're so powerful, and wow, they're so, I didn't kind of, and very much my pattern of worrying about how me setting boundaries would impact Phoenix emotionally, that came into play there. So that's where learning from Angie was really great. Does that
Actually
make sense what
practically
I
be
said?
around these creatures. Yes.
Yeah.
And not
And set
mythologize them.
boundaries.
Yeah.
Yes. And not anthropomorphize them, not kind of project my human emotion onto them. Kind of just realize that I'm not going to hurt Phoenix's feelings by asking him to lunge to the right around me. Yes. I do know. It's embarrassing too.
Well, the reason I chuckle is because I just made a note here. Do you feel, because I feel an insight that I'm getting from this is that perhaps an advantage if you're going into equine assisted work without a horsey background, provided, of course, you have good horsey mentors, because for obvious reasons. But starting as a quote unquote patient in an equine assisted therapy do you think that gives you a better insight into the patient experience for clients that don't know horses than somebody like me who, I've lived and breathed them for so long, I can't remember life without them. So there might be things I miss when someone comes in who doesn't know them. I mean, yes, of course, I'm aware that someone might be intimidated or is just, unfamiliar, etc. But it doesn't occur to me, for example, to anthropomorphize in those ways because I was taught horsemanship from a very, very young age. Do you feel that you're having come in as a latecomer like that and actually had to sort of go up against making these quote unquote mistakes of perception and so on? Do you think that actually makes you weirdly a more effective equine assisted therapist because you can empathize perhaps more with the client?
I think it definitely helps understand how a client's coming to it and how vulnerable they can feel and how powerful horses feel. I think it definitely helps teach basic horsemanship, because I think, when you master something, to then teach the basics is challenging.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, I was so worried about horses that I read everything I could. I did a study of horses, and I broke everything down to try to stay safe. In my head, I was all these scenarios and what do I do and how do I do that? And with the lady that taught me horsemanship, she was great, because I remember her asking me, what do you want to learn? And I said, I want to learn from a horse that doesn't just know what to do. I want to learn how to work with young horses or horses that are frightened, and I wanted to do that for my own confidence, because I felt like until I know what to do when a horse is in this situation, I'm not going to feel confident. Yeah.
And your husband is in this equation too, right? So is he working the horse with you? You say that the horse loved him and he loved the horse. So was it the two of you going on this journey together?
Not really. So my husband grew up on a massive sheep farm out west. So he'd grown up on horses.
So he knew horses. Right.
Yeah. But he did, but not. So he'd never had to really care for them.
Right.
He'd hopped on and ridden them, and that real old-fashioned way of, so didn't know groundwork, only knew horses of, they just eat grass and they need a dam kind of thing. So
Yeah.
didn't need more than that. So, and he wasn't really interested in learning the groundwork. He didn't have the fear I had. He
Mm.
was just comfortable. He would hop on any horse or be around any horse, where I had a real fear.
Mm.
So I wanted to really understand their body language, understand how to read it, understand how to kind of support myself to feel safe around them. And because I really wanted to do this work. But I think before you asked a question around non-horsey people
Mm.
coming in compared to horsey people coming in, I think non-horsey people, the therapy's more powerful initially just because the size of the horse and
The change of environment. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, definitely, definitely. As a therapist, I definitely have to work harder with horse people because they see horses in a certain way and are not as open to seeing how they might impact the relationship between them and the horse.
I think you
I
just
think,
described me.
well, I think I really see this again in our Western culture where we kind of have this arrogance of doing to something rather than being curious of how we might be impacting something and how something might be impacting us back. Yeah, so definitely as a therapist, it's different work with someone that's a horse person compared to someone that's never been around horses.
Are the majority of your clients non-horsey people, would you say?
No, not at all. I would say it's about half and half.
Okay. Interesting,
Yeah.
because when you get a horsey person coming to you as a patient, particularly
Yes.
if they have their own horses and they have their own relationships with their horses and are getting to some degree therapized simply by being around horses, which we all know is very healing. Otherwise, we wouldn't do
Yeah.
the work we do. What makes them seek out then something outside of that relationship that they already have with their horses to go to you? What do they come with? What do they say?
So often they've hit some kind of crisis in their relationship,
Horses or just in with human
in
relationships?
human relationships.
Okay.
Yeah, just something's not working in their human life.
Hmm.
And they're drawn to the equine assisted therapy because horses have always been their safe place.
Hmm.
And I remember Dewey explaining this beautifully, that people that have had those early relational ruptures or difficulties relationally, so maybe there was child abuse or abandonment or drug and alcohol abuse by parents, or their parents, being kind of just not great human experiences as children, that those people are more drawn to the equine therapy because they are able to trust and feel safer with an animal than they are with a human.
Hmm.
And he spoke about that power of those people that really struggle to form connections with people, able to make that connection with the horse and then slowly over time transfer that connection onto the therapist that's working with the horse. And so that's kind of what helps bridge, I guess, working with the horses for different people into healing their relational experiences with humans. There's that, but also horses help reveal what we do in relationship and give us an opportunity to try something different.
Okay. I could see that. It's interesting to think about amorphizing because, that's such a hot topic in what we do. And there's a part of me that often thinks, well, we have no choice but to anthropomorphize because that's we're looking through monkey eyes, so we're going to
Yes.
monkey what we see as a way that a
Yes.
monkey looking at us would see. And I should imagine that horses equipomorphize us, because they have no choice because they are looking through pony eyes.
Yeah.
So I often think, well, that's unavoidable and actually natural.
Mm.
So presumably it could be helpful as well as hindering depending on
Yes.
how much awareness we have that we're doing it. Would you say? But when I've got horses, I love my horses. Some of them, were born into my arms. I've known them forever, blah, 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 blah. So naturally, I relate to them kind of as family members, which, as we know, we're not always, wonderfully functional with our family members, and our family members are always wonderfully functional with us. And actually, of course, that's part of feeling safe, right? If you actually feel safe with your mum and dad, you can tell them to F off. And if a
Yes.
horse feels safe with you, something
Yeah.
I've realized over time is allowing time, because the fact my horses are working horses, they need to be able to say F off sometimes. And
Yes.
that was a really interesting dance for me to sort of get into, say, oh, I see, for you to have agency and choice, but also be my colleague when I need you to be my colleague and keep people
Yes.
safe. I, to some degree, have to anthropomorphize because I know that I certainly need that time of telling people to leave me alone or showing up when I feel ready to work. And then in the old school of horsemanship, it would have been, well, if you do that, the horse is going to run all over you, which of course is true if you don't know horsemanship. That's the paradox, right? But once you do know horsemanship, you can then begin to discern, actually, in this situation, I should let him go. He's turning his back on me in the pasture. I'm approaching with a halter. What's the difference between when I say, no, I actually need to get you today? Or, you know what? You're right. It's not the day today.
Yeah.
In the same way that we would have to do those things with people. One could say, is that not anthropomorphizing? And then could one say, well, yes, but is that anthropomorphizing functionally? And I'm not saying I have the rights or the wrongs on this. I'm just bringing them up as talking points and questions. But, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, it's as you're talking, I'm thinking of there's a concept in Gestalt called the field theory, and it talks about, it acknowledges that we all come with our own ground or our own experience, and so we're all seeing the world through lenses. And I think a horse, a dog, any being walking the planet comes with their own ground, their own experiences, and that shapes how they then interact and how they are in the world. And so to me, this is where I can get frustrated sometimes because I feel like we can get hung up on some of these words, like, oh, don't do this or don't do that. And it's like, man, we're not in boxes. We're living beings and we're having these different experiences. So, and I think as a therapist, I guess I work on how a person anthropomorphizes a horse gives me a lot of information about the person.
Right.
And we work on that. So if someone projects something onto a horse, I get curious about that in the person.
Right. I think that word curious is the word, right? Isn't it? So not saying it's right or it's wrong to project something.
Yes.
To some degree, you have no choice.
Yes.
We project and we just do. And that's actually how we navigate. Our antennae go out, right? We must to some degree. But how we, to be curious rather than to say it's right or it's wrong. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, another term is transference or countertransference. So as a therapist, we'll talk about a client will transfer emotions onto you as a therapist. So say I remind a client of their auntie, they'll transfer their emotions about their auntie onto me, and I'll countertransfer. So say they remind me of my son, then I'll countertransfer emotions of my son onto them. And when this gets unhealthy or not good is when I'm not aware of that process or not aware of that happening. And I feel this is the same with anthropomorphizing. If I'm aware of it and I'm curious about it, then I'm less likely to do it in a way that's not supportive for the horse or the client.
Got it. Yeah. And of course, this one isn't always at the top of one's game, right?
100%. But we're human. And I'm seeing the world through my own muddy lenses,
It's really interesting. I went through this just yesterday, actually. I was working with a kid who absolutely pushes my buttons and is like super rude and, but he loves my little dog and my little dog brings out the best in him. And I was tired yesterday and we'd, gone on a really magical thing. We go exploring on the horse together. So we'd gone down to a local stream. He's wading in the stream, and we're just discovering insects. He's sort of annoyed and irritated with the insects, but he's also kind of curious about them. And the dog is doing his bit. My horse is, being there and grazing and carrying him into this beautiful world and so on. And I remember, finding myself going, oh yes, I can feel myself feeling a bit negative here. Why am I feeling a bit negative? Well, it's all right if someone presses your buttons. You don't have to get along with everybody, but that's also not personal. It's also, you are tired. I could see I was tired. So what do I need to do? And then also, hold on. What about gratitude? Can I be grateful to this person, this young person who's brought me out? Because here I am having a little in my head while standing next to this very beautiful stream, listening to the music of the stream, looking at ladybugs flying with my horse and my dog. Hold on, Rupert. Perhaps a little bit of gratitude might help you in this situation. So I love what you say about awareness and curiosity, because it's so easy to either fall into a denial pattern, which can make one not behave brilliantly, or fall into an overgiving pattern, which can make one not behave, and sort of you go into a bit of martyr, mind.
Yeah.
Or if I can just be aware that I'm feeling this emotion, do I have a chance to gain some perspective? Put some tools into play, like gratitude that I'm in this situation at all, with that this is what I'm complaining about, rather than something real. I had another moment like that in Mongolia with my son, when it was 40 degrees of Celsius, and he didn't want to ride at that point, so I had him on my shoulders. I'm leading my horse, and he's putting the point of his chin in the top of my skull, and it's going on for a long time, and I start to get this negative loop. And then it's like from somewhere else, this voice says, Rupert, you're in Mongolia with your son, walking across Mongolia to see shamans in Siberia. And okay, it does hurt, that bone on your bone. Okay. But the situation is absolutely amazing. What are you complaining about? And what's your strategy? So I thought, well, really what he just needs to know that if you put his hand between his chin and my skull, that's how I came up with this thing of the chin is ouchy, but the hand is nice. And we still joke about this today, him and I, because, when we get into negative thought loops of how long it can take one just to say the chin is ouchy, but the hand. And what's that, of course, but asking for help. And I suddenly flash back to you in that airport in India, saying, I haven't got a clue. Please help me. This is very difficult as a therapist, isn't it? Because as a therapist, you're sort of expected to be a figure that sort of provides answers, and of course, you're just a human.
Yeah.
How do you deal with these moments?
Yeah. As you're talking before, and you're talking about the negative or the martyr, and I was thinking, wow, in the middle is the human. And also just what you were saying before about that wisdom of, what's your son's name again?
Rowan,
yeah. When his chin was pressing into your head, and how you realize this pain isn't all of me, like the pain's in my head, but it's not all of me. I think that's really powerful for us to realize there's pain here. I can put my hand there. I can change this. But I think what helps me is giving myself permission to be human. Giving myself permission to not have the answers, giving myself permission to show up and, just kind of, just be real. Just kind of be like, I don't know all the answers. I don't. What I can offer you is my presence, and that I'll walk along beside you on your journey, and we'll work it out. But I never pretend. I can't know. I can't have someone else's answers.
Okay, so we're now sort of talking you as you are now, but where before we digress there, you were still going through your education really in horsemanship.
Yeah.
And as we know, there's knowing a horse and there's knowing horses. And if you're going to be professional in by putting people who don't know horses together with horses, obviously we have to know horses well enough to keep people safe. So
Yeah.
how long does it take you, and how do you get there to graduate from a know nothing, afraid of this horse on your own property, to being in a position where you actually can confidently keep people safe around horses while doing a job with a horse as your colleague?
Yeah, yeah. So with me, with Phoenix and with Angie, who taught me, I was really disciplined. So I worked with him every day doing groundwork, and I went and saw Angie every week. And I think I started seeing clients about probably a year after I had done that training with Dewey. And then I got offered a job
That's
doing
quite
this
quick.
kind of work. Was pretty quick. And I feel like it is very quick when I think back. I got offered a job, and in that job, I would see 5 people back to back, 3 or 4 days a week.
Always with this
And
horse, Phoenix.
no, with the new herd.
Okay.
And it was a herd of 4 horses. And so to start with, it was a lot for me to kind of manage. And luckily they were well-handled horses,
Okay.
generally had good ground manners, except for Stevie. Stevie would threaten to bite and would nip. So I learned so much from him. And I learned a lot about how his behaviors were often a response to the state of the nervous system of me or the person he was working with. Because as the person and I settled, the nipping would reduce. Yeah, so I worked there for a few years solidly, and I learned so much from those horses and kept working with Phoenix at home. By then I'd got Java as well and a little mini Sunny. And I think I'd been working there maybe 4 years, and people started asking me to teach them. And that's when I kind of put my training together. Yeah. And
Okay.
I feel like I've been learning
Now you just
continually
very,
learning
very
since.
cavalierly said, and that's when I started putting my training together. Now, as
Yes.
someone who has this thing called Horseboy Method and a couple of other programs, we do, movement method without horses, and this thing called
Yeah.
TEI, which is used to be called Athena, which is the groundwork and the in-hand work as its own therapy. I know that putting together a program is not something you just do.
Yes.
It looks that way from the outside, but it's a torturous process. And
Yes.
a lot of us who've done that sort of thing, when we look back, we go, wow, how did I think at the beginning that I would be able to,
Yes.
and the learning curve you go through of just like how much is involved in this if you want
So
it to be
true.
of use to people.
Yeah.
Talk us through that learning curve. It must have been somewhat steep and somewhat exhausting.
It was. So for me, I hadn't even contemplated training, and then people were asking me to mentor them. And then someone said, why don't you do your own training? And a decision I came to was I want it to be government accredited. So I looked into what was involved in that. And I think I'm a very rose-colored glasses person, super naive. So I thought, okay, I'll become an RTO. So
What
I
is
did
that?
that, a registered training organization. So it's like a
Okay.
college. Yeah. So it's like the government kind of says that you go through all these processes for the government to approve what you
Tell
do.
us in brief, in summary, what are the processes that someone has to go through if they want to be that? They want to be government recognized.
It's huge. So you have to have lots of policies and procedures in place. And so you've got to prove the way you enroll people, the way you market, the way
Who do
the
you have to prove this to? What's even the
to
application process? How do you even begin this?
Yeah. So in Australia, we've got a governing body called ASQA, the Australian Skills Quality Authority. So you put together a training, and even to do that, so what I had to do was put together an outline of what I wanted to train. Then I had to go to industry bodies. So I had to go to the Australian Counselling Association, the Psychotherapy and Counselling Federation of Australia, and Equine Equestrian Australia. And I had to say, hey, I want to do this equine assisted therapy training. Will you agree that we need it in Australia? And the Australian Counselling Association came back to me and said, no, we won't agree. We don't think a qualification of just equine assisted therapy is enough. And so I was like, gosh, what can I do? And someone that was helping me at the time said, why don't you add counselling? So I added the Diploma of Counselling and the equine handling units and my own equine assisted mental health units. And I went back to the Australian Counselling Association and I said, would you approve it if it looks like this? And they said yes, because then your graduates can work in a room based as a counsellor or out in the paddock with horses. So that was the beginning of the process. Then I had to, so in the Diploma of Counselling, you've got 17 units of competency. And each of those units of competency have all these assessment tasks that you've got to kind of assess and teach. And so I had to kind of go through all of that and create a curriculum and assessments and do that for the equine handling and then for my own equine assisted mental health stuff as well. So that was kind of the process and it was huge. Like when I look back now, I'm just like, my God.
Another question.
Thank God I didn't know. Yes.
You've also got to put yourself forward, presumably, as someone who can have judgment and discernment as to whether or not someone is jumping these hurdles. So what do you have to prove to the government bodies and the governing bodies about yourself? Because you're not a psychiatrist, for example, or whatever. You might say, well, I have this qualification here and I have that qualification there. But yeah, what hoops do they want you to jump through?
So they needed to see my qualifications. They needed to see my experience. And then I needed to get different people, so other psychologists, other people in the industry to kind of sign off that I was. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Did it help that you had the background as a nurse?
I think it definitely.
Yeah, underneath
definitely.
it all, there was this solid, I went and got my qualifications in medicine in this way.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
That and I'd worked in the mental health. So I'd worked in mental health units, adolescent and adult mental health.
As a nurse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that really helped.
So in retrospect, those skills that you learned early, despite the fact that you didn't like the system, ended up being the foundation from which you could build another system.
Definitely. And when I look back, like the learning, so because where I was a nurse in the adolescent and adult mental health unit is a very low socioeconomic area in Queensland. And I learned a lot about mental health, about keeping myself safe, about supporting people to de-escalate. I learned a lot of skills. Yeah, that still help me today. And I think it's really helpful to actually be in the system and see the system so that you can understand what people go through.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So how long did this whole accreditation process takes you? How long?
I think it took about 1.5 years.
Again, that's not very long. I was expecting you to say 5 years.
Well, it took 1.5 years for me to be approved and up and running. I feel like it's taken till now to get it to a point that I'm happy with. And I feel like, okay, it's finally written and done. And I started in 2016. So that's 8 years.
Okay. That sounds more likely. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you have to do to prove to your accrediting bodies sort of year to year that you're not bullshit, that you're still, the standards are kept up, blah, 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 blah. What do you need to do?
So they come in and they go over everything. So they go over the assessments, they go over student answers, they go over what I'm teaching. They ask students for feedback. So they have a record of who my students are, so they can go directly to those students and ask them for feedback. That's pretty much.
If they get feedback that isn't positive, how does that affect what do they come to you with? Because I mean, not everyone's going to always say something positive, right? So are they coming back to you with every single nitpick and saying, you got to address this, or are they just looking for patterns? And because
No, they
they
more
also
look
have
for,
manpower problems, right? How deeply can they go?
yes, totally. No, they more look for patterns, and they'll say, hey, can you show us this? And then they'll say, okay, you need to rectify this, and you've got this amount of time to do it. Yeah.
And the way it's rectified would be you would have to then say, I've put these policies in place, and then they would come
Yeah.
in again and do another assessment and see, is the feedback
Yeah.
better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a fair amount of stress involved. I mean, it's possible to lose the
Yeah.
accreditation too, I should imagine.
Definitely. Definitely. And I know it's probably only been the last year or two that I've learned to not let that feel like a massive weight. Before then, it felt like a massive weight. It felt
I
like,
can
oh my God,
imagine.
they could swoop in at any time.
Yeah.
I, yeah, I think what's helped is seeing students. I really see students change and grow over the time they do the training. So the training's now 2 years, and seeing them be practitioners, and I think I've learned to believe in it and stand strong in it myself. And I think that has changed. So I'm not as fearful. I know that I can stand up for the decisions I've made and why we do things the way we do things with that accrediting body now. Whereas before then, I don't think I felt so strong in it.
And at the end of the 2 years, someone who's gone through the program with you is an equine
Mm.
assisted psychotherapist, effectively. Is
We
what
call
they
it,
are, or what do you call it?
we say they're an equine assisted mental health practitioner.
Okay, an equine assisted
So
mental health practitioner. Are you doing all the teaching and the mentorship yourself? Are you now a team? Do you have other campuses? Is it all in one place that you do this? How,
yeah,
how has it grown?
yeah. So we're in Gold Coast, where I am, and Melbourne and Sydney.
Mhm.
And we have other trainers that have come in, which has been, I think that's really helped me stand stronger in it as well. Having
Yeah.
other people to ask questions, other people looking at the material, other people kind of giving feedback and adding their pieces to it has been really helpful.
What's your process? So if someone becomes this equine assisted mental health practitioner,
Mhm.
from them to go from that first qualification up to say becoming a trainer in what you do, what do they have to do?
Lots of experience in the field. So see lots of clients. And I guess generally the people that are trainers now work with me as a support person. So they kind of are with me in the training, supporting me to do the trainings as well as seeing their own clients. And then there's that transition into them being a
So
trainer.
it's not necessarily a structured series of courses that they have to do. It's more that you monitor their work over a set number
Yeah.
of years and see that the results they're getting, and it's more an assessment by you of
Yeah.
competency or
Yeah. Yeah. More a feeling into whether they fit um, my business, I guess, and the way that I want to deliver this work and the way that I want to kind of, yeah, support people to learn this work.
okay. I know that I'm probably impinging on your time here because you have a
No,
lunch,
not at all.
you have an evening, but there's some other questions I'm curious about. You said at the outset that you were moving from unmounted work towards mounted work. Tell
Mm.
us about that. Why and
Yes.
how?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, this is where I'd love to do your training, Rupert. But for me, I work very somatically. So I was a yoga teacher for 5 years full time, and that massage therapy on top of that. I've always been a person that it needs to move their body and values the body. And I see that with certain clients, especially people with those early relational traumas, so complex PTSD, I see that being on the horse has more of an impact on them than being beside the horse and being held, learning to be held by the horse, feeling that movement, just that
Mm,
rocking movement.
mm,
So I'm not sure how I'm going to do it yet. I just know that that's what I'm really
okay.
drawn to. I'm
That's a
really
good
drawn
answer.
to that mountain work from that real somatic lens. So
Absolutely.
before I became an RTO, I had to do some training in being a riding instructor. And I had very little of my own experience as riding horses or being a riding instructor, but I had a lot of experience with yoga. And so I taught my riding lessons from a yogic perspective.
Okay.
And it was amazing.
How?
I had
Give us an example.
So there's this old cowboy, and he was on a horse, and the horse was stressed and uptight, and he was pulling on the reins really hard, and the cowboy's shoulders were up near his ears. And I just kind of, I guess, asked him to change his body like I would someone in yoga class. So I was like, okay, I want you to deepen your breath, relax your shoulders, relax your hands, kind of become more aware of your pelvis, relax your legs. And as he did that, the horse relaxed. And I remember this other old horseman guy go, wow, who taught you that?
Okay.
And I said to him, oh, it's yoga. And he just looked at me as if I was crazy.
Right.
But there's just, I just feel that humans have much more of an impact on a horse than we realize.
Oh, yes.
And we're so out of we're so out of awareness of our body and how we're holding a body impacts the being beneath us.
Yeah.
And for me as a therapist, when I'm working with someone and a horse, the horse tells me about the state shifts within the person, sometimes before I can recognize those state shifts in the person. And I see that when someone's on a horse, as the horse relaxes, as their stride lengthens, it reflects what's happening inside that person. And so I can kind of observe the horse and support the person to change things within their body, and then the horse reflects the change.
Yes. Yes. No, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. One of the interesting things about the old master system of dressage, I'm not talking about dressage as dressage for a judge. I'm talking about, the art of dressing a horse, which is to help it put the hind legs under the point of gravity. And that's what collection is. The human and the horse become a unit at that point and can move in 3 dimensions. And that's evolved over thousands of years. It acts as, whether it's working on the ground or whether it's working from the saddle, it acts as both a yoga and a martial art because it's designed for both. So it can train, but it can also rehab. It can maintain. It can also develop. And I think that if you're coming from a yoga perspective, I think that's a very easy concept to get. Whereas I think if one's coming from just a straight up horse training, I am a monkey that tells a horse what to do perspective, it is not so easy to get. The martial arts perspective might be easier to get. I'm training this horse to go to war. I'm training this horse to catch a cow. I'm training this horse to go over this jump. Yes. But of course, as we know, it's only one part of a very big whole. And it may not even be part of it. So I'm rather intrigued. I'd love to collaborate with you because I think coming from that perspective that you have, again, offers interesting insights to people when they're having to rethink how they approach horses and horse training. It's difficult if you grew up with it because your synapses in your brain are fairly hardwired at that point. One has, and your body to unlearn certain things. When I was learning classical dressage, which I had to do when I realized that it was the soft collection that created the oxytocin in the child or the adult that calmed down the amygdala, the stress hormone, cortisol, cancels that out. And of course, it's a communication hormone, oxytocin. So makes them communicate. And I realized, I need to learn more about this and do my deep dive. And of course, at that point, I was very much more of a sort of jumping rider, lots of tension in the leg, lots of tension in the body, which you actually sort of need for that job. And then I realized, I had to neutralize. And that took me about 5 years, So when I'm approaching, and then I realized I could actually, but all the training has to be done from the ground so that there can be a neutral rider up there who can just flow with the horse. When I'm working with people who are coming out of a lifetime of horses, this can be tricky because no one likes to be a beginner again, obviously. And also there are, as you said, just these sort of synapses, mental pathways that are very hardwired that need to be. So something, the way you just explained it there, I think could be very useful for someone that is needing to go to that next phase with horses, but doesn't quite know how. That sort of glassy feel.
Yes. And what's really cool is you're talking about needing to change the body, bringing your body back into neutral. And you doing that through working with the body has an impact on who you are as a human, on how you do relationships, on how you think, on everything about you. And that's what I love too. Like Deb Dana, who
Yes.
writes a lot of, talks about, change the state, change the story. And this is what I love about working with the body. When you bring a sense of ease to the body and a sense of relaxation and openness, the whole way our mind sees the world changes.
Which is difficult to do when you're an anxious monkey sitting on a moving barrel that has a mind of its own and a sense of humor, and you are the butt of the joke. Yes.
Very, very, totally. I wanted to share I went to Mongolia too. So
Did you?
My husband and I, we went there. We did a 19-day horse ride and we went up to the reindeer people.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And so it was amazing. Gosh,
You may well have met the same people that I was with my son.
What a magical country.
Isn't
I just
it?
loved Mongolia. Oh,
Intact
even
ecosystem.
that and their people
Yes.
like
The
that.
people that live in intact ecosystems, tend to be cool, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
They blew me away, just how authentic they were, how even I took kind, real. I loved their realness. Like, because I talk to students a lot about boundaries and how in Mongolia there's no fences.
Yeah.
But they have a deep respect for boundaries.
Yeah.
So they don't need the physical fences.
Absolutely.
Like we don't respect boundaries and we need the fences.
Absolutely.
And
fences could be broken and climbed over and jumped over. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But I loved their Buddhism, shamanism. That was just
Absolutely.
like, and not the not the dogma of it, the living of it. That's what I loved.
Yeah. No, I'm so with you. And actually, when you were talking about working with a First Nations elder there in Queensland, this thing of informing oneself through Indigenous wisdom, one of the things one forgets is that horses don't come, when you're a white person from Europe, horsemanship is not European. It comes out of, it's a bit European. It comes out of the mixed liminal space between Europe and Asia. But it went more into Asia first before it came into Europe proper.
Mm-hmm.
It was in Asia for thousands of years because that's where the civilizations were. People in Europe, Western Europe particularly, were just sort of living in forests for quite a while at that point. And so it doesn't really creep in. It like you with a name like Faulkner, me with a name like Isaacson. It doesn't come into the culture of our ancestors until quite a lot later. But it's still an indigenous thing. And one of the conclusions that my wife and I came to a while ago, because we teach people a lot of dressage as well as the therapeutic stuff, is you actually can't do it unless you do it in a tribal way, because it's a tribal system. It came out of people living in tents who were families who collaborated. And when you go to the Spanish Riding School of Vienna or the Royal School of Jerez in Spain, what do you observe? You see groups of people collaborating 2 to 3 at a time with a horse to help it understand as quickly and as easily, with as much, not pressure, but moral support as it can. And that's a tribal thing. So we have this program called Riots Clubs. We show people how to form. Riding is a tribal sport. And the difficulty is doing things in isolation. It's almost impossible, right? But of course, this is message for life, right? Yeah.
I love, have you heard about, how we kind of swallowed the Darwin theory of survival of the fittest? And you've heard of the Russian researcher that actually kind of debunked that theory.
Tell us all about it. Yeah, tell us about this.
I can't think of names, but so around the time that Darwin came to that conclusion of, survival of the fittest, the strongest conquers everything, the strongest wins. So a Russian researcher around the same time did the same kind of research, and he found the opposite. He found that the people that survived, or the communities that survived and prospered, were the people that could form relationships, the people that could form collaborations, the people that could be part of communities, and the people that weren't able to make those relationships or sustain those relationships. And same as the animals, the people or the animals that weren't able to do that were the ones that died.
Absolutely.
And it's just fascinating that we grabbed the Charles Darwin instead of the other
Well,
one.
it suited our worldview at the time, right? Which was
Yeah, so true.
But of course,
Individualism.
what was colonialism? Colonialism was groups of people, not single. We talk about Cortez. He conquered Mexico. No, he didn't. Cortez was in charge of a very, very large group of people, all working cooperatively to do something psychopathic and horrible. But nonetheless, the people that conquered, in inverted commas, the American West were not John Wayne types. They tended to die of thirst in the desert. The John Wayne types who actually sort of made it were the ones who led and helped groups of settlers come together. And of course, outside of the colonial experience, I work a lot with hunting and gathering tribes. Those are entirely, and those are the original human blueprints. Those are entirely cultures of conflict resolution, because if you have conflict within your community beyond a certain level, your community will fragment. And if your community fragments, guess what? You're a mid-level predator. You're not top predator. So the lion will absolutely eat you. The only thing we've got is this ability, oxytocin connection, to strategize with a speaking ape. We have the larynx. So we're very, very good at strategizing, but only if we feel connection and feel safe with our community. That is the only security we have. And I agree with you, yet we're sold a myth of the lone warrior hero. Like, say it's Cuchulainn, the great Irish hero, the Hound of. Well, what happens to Cuchulainn in the end? He gets killed gloriously. What happens to Hercules in the end? He gets killed. Okay, they put him in the start. But, they're glorious deaths, perhaps. Maybe they even think they go to Valhalla, die sword in hand. But fact is, they die.
Yeah. And not only that, like, I feel like I think of even our industry where we have this thing of who's the best or be the best.
Terrible.
And it drives me nuts. It's like, why does there need to be a best?
Well,
imagine if we all came together and shared knowledge
within the horse industry in general, within therapy industry in general, within academia, within therapeutic writing. We all know that it can be very toxic, and the nastiness with which people treat each other is bizarre always to me, given that we're supposed to be in a modality of healing. You don't have to like everybody.
It's
actively
wild.
Working against people. How is that us doing our job?
To me, it slows us all down.
Indeed.
If our whole goal is to help people and to kind of make the world a better place, and I don't know, I just think
But if you think about it,
together.
In a weird way, we come by these dysfunctions naturally, honestly, because we all get put through a school system where we're supposed to be in competition with our classmates, and then with other wider people out there in exams that will say, well, were your exams good enough against all these other people that you've never met to then get to this university? And then at this university, are your grades good enough, that you will get this level of degree? And then when you go out into the workplace, you've got to, quote unquote, prove yourself against your peers. And then if you add horses to that, and then academia, it's all about defending a position or you lose your job, you lose your funding. So you got to be right all the time, which means you must attack those who take an opposing view.
Yeah.
Or because there's an economic, imperative to that. And then horse people, well, what's the horse tradition we've inherited? Most of us that grew up with the sort of pony club, even though there were so many wonderful things with that, it's a military thing. It came out of the 1845, military manuals that were in the cavalry schools, and the people that ran riding schools in the old days were ex-cavalry officers, because that's what they did when they retired. So this whole sort of military industrial thing permeates. So then someone pops up at the out of all that and says, well, now I'd like to use this modality of this thing I learned through academia to heal, and this thing I learned with the horse heal, but I've learned them through a sort of slightly sociopathic process. How can that not rub off on us? So I do have compassion for that, and I do understand it, but it makes me sad because, as you say, I feel it slows us down.
Yeah. And I love that now we can at least talk about it and there's an awareness of it. I just have a question for you, Rupert.
Mm.
For me, the
Hold on,
horses
I'm the
in
one doing the
Mongolia.
interviewing here, Miss Faulkner.
Sorry. The horses in Mongolia, there was just something so different about them to our domesticated horses. Like, I'm curious about that, and I just wonder what you've all. So for me, what was different is they seem to. So even for me, the Mongolian people not naming their horses, but it was like the horse knew their role, the human knew their role, and there was a real cleanness to it. There wasn't this kind of merging or gray zone. It was kind of the horse has its job to do, I have my job to do. Because you could see the love for the horse, and it was amazing to watch the Mongolian people ride. I just well, my husband and I were both like, wow.
Right. I mean, what you're looking at there is, of course, one of the original versions of horsemanship. And so there's bad and good, and there's everything in
Yeah,
it.
totally.
I mean,
Yes.
people can be incredibly brutal and rough with their horses
Cruel.
there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the horses are also largely left alone to be horses. There are people who absolutely name their horses. And for example, there's a whole subculture of horse racing there. And, very, very, a lot of money changes hands. And it's not horse racing as we know it.
Wow.
It's the 30-mile races across country with 8-year-old jockeys, but nonetheless, it's a
The
very
Nadam Festival,
the
is that
Nadam
one?
festival, yeah. And then when it gets competitive, the mounted archery, the mounted wrestling, the nomad game, cock paru, which is the sort of rugby on horseback that they play. So there's, like in our culture, there's working horsemanship and practical horsemanship, and then there's sport horsemanship, and of course all the interplays between. But I think what's different there is that it's still a place where people genuinely rely, like truly rely on horses for their livelihood. It's not you can make a sport out of your culture, but the culture is the culture of the horse.
Yeah.
I mean, to the point that they're wearing them, that they're eating them, that they're drinking them.
So true.
The horse is everything in life. It's not just a thing you ride, or it's not just transport, or it's not just winning you money in a race. You're drinking its milk. The whole lot. So and then of course, one thing I really liked about Mongolia was that they still revere the original wild horse. So their horses are not wild; they are domestic horses. They just live very naturalistically. But there's still the Przewalski's horse, and their name for the Przewalski's horse is Takin, which means honored one. That one you leave alone. It's really interesting. You absolutely respect its independence. So our program that we have, which is doing all the groundwork and the in-hand dressage work as its own therapy, we call TEI, Takin Equine Integration, because I liked that word of the honored one, of coming to the horse and saying, I do revere you. I'm going to anthropomorphize the shit out of this, but I do. I just have to, because horses do represent a big thing in our mythology and in our spirit, and they represent freedom, and they represent power, and they represent beauty, and they represent transformation and journey, and they just flat out do. And that is sort of what they do for us. So what can we do to them for them? We can honor them. We can honor them in the same way that we can honor each other.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because we miss that, don't we?
We do.
As in just that I think that's a great thing to bring back in. But as you were talking and you spoke about their independence, and I think that's what stood out for me in the Mongolian horses, that I don't see so much in the domesticated horses here, is this independence, this almost this sovereignty, this kind of, they're out living kind of wild and free for 5 months of the year over there. And I remember just really feeling this difference in the horses and in their kind of just the way their beingness.
Absolutely. And there's pros and cons with that, because some of them die in the winter. Some of them get eaten by wolves. Some of them, die in childbirth or whatever. But one thing I think you're right that I took from it was I've kept my horses in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah.
I've kept them in boxes. I've kept them not in boxes. I've kept them outside all the time. I've kept them half and half. And what I've realized over time is my preference is to have horses that live out all the time and that can come into a shelter. And in the winter here in Northern Europe, yes, you have to rug them and that sort of thing. But you can have horses working at a very high performance level, living very naturalistically like that in a herd, moving in and out, eating at will, moving at will. And then if you are in a situation where you have to have a horse that's convenient and clean, like some of our horse boy centers, we have a lot of those places will put them out at night. And then in the day, they might stand in so that you don't have to groom the horse from mud every single time. You're going to put someone on it, which, okay, fine. So that's the working time of day and they're there and they're available.
Yep.
But they're also moving a lot. They're not bored. They're not standing
Yes.
hour after hour in a box. They're just kind of chilling in between sessions. But then, boof,
Yeah.
they're outside at night and they go back to being horses again. That's my preferred method. However, I work in so many environments where people don't necessarily have that choice. And I've been around a lot of horsemanship clinics and symposiums where people shame each other and say, well, you shouldn't keep your horse in a box and you shouldn't. And someone said, well, I haven't got any choice because, I board my horse at this livery stable and these are the rules. And I'm sorry, but I've got the money to buy myself, 20 acres. And so, and what I realized with that is, what you need to do is kind of do it the best you can while honoring the horse's need for independence, movement, choice, agency, and so on. But that can look quite different from horse owner to horse owner or barn to barn or local horse culture to local horse culture, because depending on certain constraints, and that we have to have some compassion for this and work with people where they are, and horses where they are, right? But I do think you're absolutely right that if you're taking as a sort of a baseline, well, we would like to be as close to this Mongolian model as we can. Do that. Does that mean that I have to let my horses free run in the arena for a certain number of hours in the day or what? But are we at least thinking in these times?
Yeah. And for me, it wasn't even, I was just curious about, because I could feel the difference and I was just curious about it and what created the difference. And then I guess as you were talking, I was like, oh, that's what it is. Because for me, I totally agree. Everyone does the best with what they have, with what they know, with where they're at. And I would love it if we could all have more generous assumptions and ask questions and be curious rather than kind of judge one another. Yeah.
I feel that we're slowly getting there. I think
I agree.
Organizations like yours are a part of that. And I think, again, that is perhaps an advantage that you have from coming in from outside the horse culture, is that you can bring a certain lack of judgment, which helps we horse people to be less judgmental, because let's forget the humans that we're serving. The big question here is horse welfare. And so my horses need to be happy and they need to have well-being, because how can they possibly impart happiness and well-being to a human if they don't have that to give, right? So this is the big conversation, I think, of our time as horse people is, given the constraints that we have, how do we ensure that well-being? Yeah.
And I love that we're working that out, like more and more. And for me, clients help me see that. Like clients in the early days were right on to the horse doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
And so I had to kind of think, all right, how can I do this differently? How can I support this horse to still be in the conversation in a way that it feels comfortable?
Can you give us the example that stands out in your mind most of that?
Yeah. So for me, I was working with the herd of horses at the retreat that I worked in. And there was one horse that was just lovely and very giving and would kind of always come forward for work. And I was quite early on in my practice, so relied on a lot of work with the horses haltered. And I remember going to this horse, Jack, his name was, and going to put the halter on, and he obviously did not want the halter on. And I put it on anyway. And I felt like shit the whole session. And I remember promising him, I'll never do that to you again. And realizing it meant I was going to let people down, because these people paid a big amount of money for these sessions. And it meant that I needed to work out a different way to work, to give people insights and awareness into what was happening for them without making Jack do all the work on a halter or
And
with that.
so what did you work out, given that you have to dance between honoring what the client is showing up and paying money to do, which is a real thing.
Yeah.
The need for the horse as a colleague, which is a real thing.
Yeah.
And the need to recognize their horse's agency, which is a real thing. What did you do?
So for me, I learned to get really curious about everything the horses did in relation to what the person said and did. And I learned to support the person to get curious about that too. And I started to notice like more and more that the horses did give really clear indicators of and support the person to become really aware of themselves in a way that was much more profound than if the horse was halted. So, for example, if the person was really dysregulated and really thinking things or had a lot of emotion, generally the horses wouldn't want to be near that person. But then as the person got in touch with their feelings and became congruent, so became authentic and maybe even spoke to me or the horse about their feelings, the horses turned in and wanted to engage. And so the people realize like, because something I'll ask somebody when a horse does something, like if a horse or 4 horses move away, I might say to that person, is that familiar? And the person will go, yeah, it feels like my family. And then it's like, what's that like? Can you tell the horses, what's that like for you? And as they tell the horses, something in the person shifts and the horses respond to that state shift. Often it means the person needs to become more vulnerable or more real. And that's what the horses respond to. And then the person can join the dots and they realize like, oh gosh, when I'm uptight and stressed, it pushes my family away. But when I own what I'm feeling and I'm honest about what's happening for me, my family want to come closer. So that's where horses I find are amazing. They give a really tangible indication of where that person's at, and they give the person an opportunity to try something different, and they respond. And the person feels it in their body.
I would agree. And I would agree with that right across every human interaction with horses, whether it's therapeutic or whether it's working equitation with cow work or whether it's sport or whatever, for sure. And I think everyone who's serious about any of the interactions with horses to some degree comes to this realization that you have to change something in yourself often and frequently, not just once, because you're dealing with organisms that reflect where you are. So as you say, if it took me a long time, for example, when I am going to do a dressage type thing, to be really okay with feeling where the horse is at. And sometimes they're like, no, it's not what I want. I'm like, you know what? No problem. Let's just go in the forest. And then frequently when we've gone in the forest, they're like, you know what? Actually, that dressage thing, I kind of feel like doing a little bit of that. And that's exactly how I would be. I would be like,
Yes.
look, I want to just, go chill first. And then when I've had a little bit of a run around and explore, then yeah, I'm kind of want to engage in this kind of absorbing thing, but
Yes.
that totally reflects my personality. Why would they not?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it deepens the relationship, doesn't it? Like for me, it just creates a much more profound, deep relationship, but it takes humility. It takes willing to, like for me, in front of clients or students, being willing to go, look, I don't know what's going to happen. They're walking away.
Well, this thing, I think what people fear very, very, for very real and good reasons is that if, you're a horse professional or whatever, and your horse doesn't want to participate, well, you're letting people down and you're not delivering the service that you said you would. Or if you're not doing it professionally, but you've just been told, you've got to tell the horse what to do, you've got to be boss of the horse, or the horse won't respect you. And although there's truths in that, there's not the whole truth, but there are certain truths in that. What I found, and I'm sure you found, but perhaps this might be useful for listeners, is just to inform people up front. So for example, if I am giving a quote unquote dressage thing, in just the same way as if I'm giving a quote unquote therapy thing, I'll often say to the clients, look, it could go like this and it could go like that for these reasons.
Yeah.
If it goes like this, then my suggestion is we go blah, blah, blah. And if it goes like
Mhm.
that, my suggestion, or we might just go straight to the thing. But
Mm.
are you okay with that
Mhm.
flexibility before we begin? And you sort of give them a chance to say, first to understand, and then
Yeah.
to say, well, okay, or no, actually, I'm not okay with that, in which
Yeah.
case we can say, well, perhaps we're not the right fit for each other. That's all right too. But I find with most people, it's more about just giving the information. If you give the information, give people a chance to understand. I'm the same. If you give me a chance
Yeah.
to understand, I'm probably okay with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I agree. Yeah, that transparency.
So I've got a question for you. I would like to have you on again. There's lots of other questions I've got for you. So if you're up for it,
Oh,
I'd do
yeah.
a part two or even a part three with you. And I'm sure that the listeners feel the same. I am thinking back to that girl, the young girl who was living in her car in Brisbane,
Mhm.
who you saw when she was 13 years old, living in her car, having to do whatever she could do to survive. If she was your client now, how would you help her?
Mm. Great question. So I would help her just by being an equal human beside her. Yeah.
Yeah.
And keeping it that simple. Just by being an equal human that valued her and
Mm,
that saw the gold within her, that
mm,
that didn't see what she did, or because she would bring a lot of shame,
mm.
I imagine.
I'm so sure.
And yeah, to honor that shame and to support her to see her light and to let her know that's what I see.
To perhaps honor the courage that it takes to go into something that is going to cause that shame. That takes
Yeah.
great courage, right?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And more just to let her know her shame's welcome and it makes sense that it's there and that there's nothing wrong with that shame being there
Oh, okay.
and that
Shame
she's
as well.
much more
What,
than,
what does that mean? That's intriguing. Okay.
yeah. So, I mean,
Okay.
we
Because
all,
normally we think shame is something that isn't so welcome, because it has negative associations. So why is shame welcome? Tell us about that.
because shame's trying to protect us in some way. Shame's trying to reveal something to us in some way. Shame's part of being human. And so if I reject it or push it away, I reject or push away a part of myself.
Mm.
And I don't want a client to do that. And they'll be pushing away the most vulnerable part of themselves. And I more want to say, hey, I see that vulnerable part and it is so welcome here. And thank you for showing me that part of you. And can you let that part of you know I'm so grateful it's shown up? That takes courage. So I never ever want anyone to reject their shame. That's healing for me, is learning to pick your shame up and hold it and say, hey, I've got you. Yeah, and accept it, bring it close. We learn to
Almost
push it away
like
and reject it.
like inner child healing,
Yeah.
effectively. Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I think we need another conversation about that. If you're up later.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
I think everyone, and I think whether you're person suffering from it, which is everyone on the planet, or whether you're the person who helps somebody with it, I thought is really from the conversation is, well, what are the positive sides of it? And why might it be welcome? And what might it be doing for you that's helping you? And how is it helping you to acquire wisdom? And how is it
Yeah.
helping you to acquire compassion? And how is it looking through the lens of the heart? As I don't know if you know Kansas Caradine and her work with Heart Math Institute, but she would say, I feel terrible speaking of Kansas Caradine. Sorry, Kansas, but she might say, looking through the lens of the heart.
Mm.
And one of the when she said that to me, it hit immediately. That is exactly what we are trained not to do.
Yes,
You talked about
and
Darwin.
it's what we all need. Yes. To see one another through the lens of the heart. That's such a beautiful saying, the lens of the heart.
Because it renders us uncontrolled. And we're not going to go off and fight and die on a foreign battlefield if we're looking through the lens of the heart.
It's so true. And we want to support each other and build one another
and
up.
churches don't have much. No. They don't have much incentive to help us to see that way.
So true. And yet we crave it, hey?
Like oxygen.
Yeah.
Like love. Wow, Jane Faulkner, thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much.
Okay, so with the knowledge that we're going to explore some more things, for those, I think we should sign off and let people digest this so far. What are the resources? Just give us the web stuff, books, whatever, where people can find you, YouTube, the lot. Just how do they find their way to you and your stuff?
Sure. Website is Equine Assisted Therapy Australia.com.au. And Facebook is the same, Equine Assisted Therapy Australia, and same as Instagram. And that's about it. No books yet,
but
Rupert.
the website is .com.au, chaps. Okay, so those outside of Australia, remember it's an AU on the end after the .com.
Yes, thank you.
But I presume if they type Equine Assisted Australia into Google, it'll still come up to you.
Hopefully.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rupert. I've loved this conversation.
Thank you. Likewise, I learned a lot. So thank you for mentoring me. And I look forward to the next one.
Awesome. Thanks, Rupert.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join our website, newtrailslearning.com, to check out our online courses and live workshops in Horseboy Method, Movement Method, and Athena. These evidence-based programs have helped children, veterans, and people dealing with trauma around the world. We also offer a horse training program and self-care program for riders on longridehome.com. These include easy-to-do online courses and tutorials that bring you and your horse joy. For an overview of all shows and programs, go to rupertisaacson.com. See you on the next show. And please remember to press subscribe and share.